Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With Israel's ongoing war on Gaza, U.S. negotiations with Iran, and Trump's upcoming visit to the region, does America have a grand vision for the Middle East? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Donald Trump has now firmly cemented his reputation as a major disruptor. And we're not just talking about the tariffs and the economy and global trade. In the Middle East, he's floated the idea of expelling all 2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and building a French Riviera project in its place. He pushed for a ceasefire, but when Israel decided to break it and resume the war, he supported that as well, and then doubled down on the U.S. war against Yemen. Now he's pushing for negotiations to end the stalemate between Tehran and Washington, which he exacerbated in his first term when he tore up the deal that was already in place. Soon he's going to be heading to the Gulf states to drum up investment for the United States, among other priorities. So what can we make of the Trump doctrine for the region? Today we're talking with Stephen Cook, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. Stephen, thank you so much for helping to come, make sense of all the different currents that are going on right now in the Middle East. And I think President Trump is planning a trip over to the Middle East to kind of drum up business and investment into the United States.
Right.
Let me just ask you, for that presidential trip to be successful, I'm just asking from a White House perspective.
Right.
What are the things they have to get right? What's possible given all of the instability in the region right now?
Yeah, I think that actually the president's planned trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE is now on the agenda, is easier than it's been for his predecessors, because the president is mostly interested in walking away from those meetings with leaders with commitments from them to invest in the United States or commitments from them to buy U.S. weapons. Sure, there will be discussions about the Houthis in Yemen and U.S. military operations against the Yemenis. There will be discussions about Gaza. There will be discussions about direct or indirect negotiations with the Iranians. But what really the president wants, in keeping with his Make America Great, America First, is commitments from world leaders to say, we're investing $1 trillion in the United States.
So that's what he most wants.
That's what he most wants.
How badly does he want to discuss Gaza?
I don't think he wants to discuss Gaza at all.
Right.
I think that the administration has thrown its support behind the Israeli government, although I think that behind the scenes there are some breaks on the Israelis. I think there are some signals from the administration that the Israelis are getting a long leash, but they're going to have to wrap this up as soon as they
Stephen, let me ask you something
can.
that I thought I would never see before, which is the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Washington, and he had a robust agenda, a lot talked. And it's one of the only times, I actually think it's the second time that a head of government meeting with the President of the United States didn't get a press conference. They didn't allow a press conference. That happened with Zelensky of Ukraine. But were you surprised by that? Is that a sign that there's tension in the buddyship?
I don't know whether it's a sign of the tension that exists, but there is definitely tension. And there was tension beforehand. I think that the people who thought that President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu were two peas in a pod weren't really understanding what was going on and didn't look very closely at what happened during Trump's first term in office, where he was concerned that Netanyahu would undermine him at every turn. And in fact, Netanyahu did try to undermine the president. And through the series of elections, Israeli elections that happened from the time President Trump took office until he left office, President Trump was not rooting for Benjamin Netanyahu to become the prime minister. There is a trust deficit between those two gentlemen.
But I want to, before you chip in, one of the other elements out there is right now Israel is in a lot of Syria. They're in there's sort of a expansion of a lot of things, but Syria is very much on people's minds and part of the regional dynamic there. And so Turkey and Erdogan is playing into this. And I want to play a little clip for you and get your reaction to it of President Trump commenting for a minute about Turkey and Israel. Let's listen to President Trump.
Any problem that you have with Turkey, I think I can solve. I mean, as long as you're reasonable. You have to be reasonable. We have to be reasonable. Thank you very much, everyone.
We have to be reasonable. I love that line, we have to be reasonable. I mean, kind of like saying, we don't need conflicts here and there, but surfacing the Turkey-Israel divide, probably over Syria, but maybe over Gaza, maybe over other issues.
Over a variety of issues.
I mean, I'd love our audience to understand a little bit more of the recipe of that tension.
Yeah, but first, before we get that, Jared Kushner's book about his time in the White House is very, very clear about the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. There was a lot of tension significant trust deficit. Now, on to Syria. Look, the Israelis since October 7th have vowed to change the security environment around them. Not a lot of people took them at face value, but everything that they've done since then should underline the fact that they were very, very serious about it. And that's why they're doing the kinds of things that they've been doing in Syria. From their perspective, taking and holding territory, keeping the Turks out as best as possible from Syria, which they regard Turkey. You know, this is two countries that once had very good working relations, a robust economic relationship, some of which still continues. But the Israelis and the Turks have been at loggerheads for years over Gaza, over Turkey's support for Hamas, over President Erdogan's rhetoric about Prime Minister Netanyahu being a Nazi. There are all kinds of things that divide those two countries. And what the Israelis have wanted to prevent is for the Turkish government to establish a military presence in Syria. And that's why they've been bombing Syrian air bases. They've destroyed most of the remnants of the Assad military. But now they're in a mode where they don't want to allow a country which is, from their perspective, an enemy state in all but name, to place itself in a position where they could do harm to Israel. Now, President Trump, unlike his relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, has a very good personal relationship with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. And after the Israelis, in this most recent round of airstrikes on Syrian air bases, the Turks recognized that this was a very, very big deal for the Israelis and have quietly sought de-escalation. The Israelis have also sought de-escalation. And in recent days, we've heard that the Turkish foreign minister is engaged in talks with Israelis about a de-escalation mechanism in Syria. The Azerbaijanis, who have a very good relationship with Turkey and Israel, are also engaged in efforts to de-escalate. But President Trump is very, very important here because he has such a good working relationship with President Erdogan that he's really the key to de-escalating here. And the Israelis are actually afraid of Trump.
You talked about the limits of ambition for the United States in your book. What are the limits of ambition for Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel?
There are all kinds of traps in what the Israelis are doing. But let me just say that I agree. I mean, setting aside the moral questions, of which there are many.
Many moral questions. I want to make sure that that's on the
Israel's
table.
in a better geostrategic position today than it was on October 6, 2023, the day before the Hamas attacks. Hamas has been greatly weakened. Hezbollah, greatly weakened, unable to muster the forces to help defend the Assad regime last December. Iran has lots of damage to its air defense systems, its missile production capabilities. They're much more careful about what they're doing. There are stories about the Iraqi militias negotiating to lay down their arms because they've been intimidated by both the U.S. force of arms as well as Israeli force of arms. Setting aside all of that, in the Israeli vow to change the security environment, they have or are at risk of overreaching. Well, these airstrikes in Gaza recently, they've killed 50 people. Sure, it got one of the commanders, the field commanders of Hamas. But to what end? It was a tactical victory, but how does that bring this conflict to an end? How do the Israelis get victory from that? By killing more people? It doesn't make any sense. But what you see in the new Israeli chief of staff and the new Israeli defense minister is a much, much harder line on Gaza. And there's clearly a desire here to use force of arms for victory, which in no way, shape, or form is going to bring this to an end in a way that's going to be good for everybody. Syria, sure, the Israelis want to take territory. They're back in the zone that the UN controlled for all of those years. But now they're saying they're going to stay there in perpetuity. They're going to occupy more land of another Arab country. This is not a recipe for
Is that
Israeli
what Donald
security.
Trump would, in his parlance, be reasonableness?
I think he means by reasonableness is, we understand your security concerns. Why are you 45 miles from Damascus? Why are you undertaking airstrikes in Damascus during the day? You can have a buffer zone. You can have good relations with the Druze there, but you don't need to occupy territory in perpetuity. There are ways in which you can work with regional actors to ensure that the new regime in Syria is not threatening to Israel. But if you're going to occupy territory, if you're going to undertake airstrikes against Syrians anywhere, you're only going to inflame tensions. Similarly in Lebanon, the United States has given Israel the right to enforce the ceasefire by using arms. But for the first time in, 40 years, the Israelis have a government in Lebanon that is willing to play ball with them. And the more that the Israelis take this aggressive action against Hezbollah to enforce the ceasefire, it gives political ammunition for Hezbollah to undermine a good thing that the Israelis have going in Beirut right now. This is what I'm talking about, overreach. And I think whether it's the president or Secretary of State Rubio or the National Security Advisor or Mr. Witkoff, have to be saying to Prime Minister Netanyahu when they're talking about what the president means by reasonableness.
Let me ask you, when it comes down to, the circumstances in Gaza now, the very obvious collapse and decimation of the ceasefire, what are the incentives to come back to something? What incentives does Hamas have to release hostages now? Are they, is there any leverage in that relationship now, or does Israel hold all the cards?
The Israelis are in a very advantageous position with regard to Hamas right now. But my sense is, and this is just my spidey sense, is that the Israelis are calculating that there is, of the remaining hostages, there is a significant number who are dead, and that the other ones can be sacrificed for their own strategic goals. And those strategic goals are, quote, the victory over Hamas. I think this is going in a very, very bad direction, and I've been an outlier in Washington on this.
What does victory over Hamas look like?
Well, and when you talk to the Israelis, they say, look, there's still going to be this ideology around, but there'll be a lot less of Hamas fighters and their leaders in order to put this ideology into operation. But this is where I think this is going, and you hear it. You start hearing it, where the new leaders of the IDF are talking about, well, we're going to take territory and we're going to occupy that territory. I think that this is the prelude of an Israeli reoccupation of either parts or all of the Gaza Strip, and that there is a strong pull on the right wing of Israel to resettle the Gaza Strip. And I had said this to the Biden administration, and they didn't want to hear it. But I think this is certainly a direction in which this is going. And you can tell by the reaction of the Israeli right to what President Trump said about the United States owning it. They don't want the United States to own it, but they do like the idea of there being less and less and less Palestinians in the Gaza Strip.
I don't believe I'm wrong to say that there's been a confidence in the Saudi relationship that they had secured. They were getting somewhere with Israel, even with Gaza going on. They were getting somewhere with Trump. And I went to a couple of these dinners and I said, are you sure that you should be so confident?
Right.
Because I see Donald Trump as a guy who basically flips on everybody he's close to, and I bet you he'd be interested in doing a deal with Tehran. And lo and behold, there are now secret negotiations going underway with Tehran. How has that hit the region? Is this going to be a new dynamic, and I would even dare say distraction from some of what may be going on in Palestine?
Yeah, it's certainly a distraction from what's going on in Palestine. I think that's undeniably the case, and I think that's from the Israeli perspective, that's good for them, but it's not good for them for the United States to be negotiating directly or indirectly with the Iranians. And this is what those of us who talk to Israelis, I spent some time in Israel in the fall of 2024, and there were a lot of people who were very enthusiastic about the prospect of a Donald Trump presidency. I said, he does not have the same kind of ideological affinity for Israel that President Biden does. Right. And so if he sniffs a deal, if he thinks there's a possibility for a deal, he's not going to look after your interests.
With his
he wants
name
to have,
on it, and
exactly, that's his pathway. Not to be too cynical about the president, but that's his pathway to a Nobel Peace Prize. And we all know that the president is interested in the accolades of the world. I think it's undeniable that the president.
Let me just ask: wouldn't Donald Trump deserve the Nobel Peace Prize if he got that kind of deal with Iran that resolved some of the simmering tensions that have been going on between the Sunni and the Shia world there, and it just is a real jump. And would the Saudis, would the Emiratis be willing to embrace it? My sense is they would, but what is yours?
I think that they would as well, but they have sought better relations with the Iranians because of the things that have happened in Washington. Whether it was the JCPOA, and this is a bipartisan, they're angry at both Democrats and Republicans. The JCPOA, they felt, did not cover their interests. President Trump, in the summer of 2019, after the Iranians attacked Abqaiq and Khurais, did nothing. So the Saudis and the Emiratis came to the conclusion that for all of the words from Washington about being committed to security and stability in the region, the United States really wasn't. And so the best way to secure themselves is undertaking a rapprochement with the Iranians. And that's where the Chinese came in with the Saudis, and the Emiratis took it upon themselves to seek a rapprochement with the Iranians.
So
the Israelis are in a real hard spot here because they put all of their eggs in the Donald Trump basket, and he clearly doesn't have that kind of sense that Biden did about Israeli security.
Well, Trump uses leverage, and the question is he going to use leverage before this trip to get Israel to wind down or turn the conflict with Gaza down a bunch of notches? And I think it's a very interesting question about the Houthis in Yemen as well. Does that continue on its own? I mean, I think one of the questions is out there is how much we overplay Iran's control and also the Yemeni interest in having Iranian support. But those are the two hot spats that would be part of the ecosystem when Donald Trump went over, and whether he would use his leverage to shut those down as a confidence-building measure, and would Netanyahu cooperate?
I suspect on the Yemeni front, the United States will continue its military operations as a show of force to the Iranians going into these negotiations. That's his leverage. And when it comes to the Israelis, there is some thought out there that he has given them a number of weeks to bring it to an end. But that doesn't guarantee that the Israelis are going to comply. I mean, they are afraid of Trump. They have a lot of allies in Washington, however. And this is existential from their perspective. So they may try to defy Trump on Gaza, which they've done before. Look, the Israeli perspective, and I think it's widely shared in Israel, is why should we take advice from people who couldn't get it done in Iraq and Afghanistan? These are terrible analogies, but in the way where they sit and where they look at the world, that is, I think, in Israeli officialdom, as well as a lot of Israelis, is why are we taking advice from the United States right now? I think what's put a brake on the Israelis with regard to attacking the Iranian nuclear program is their concern about Trump's response to it. I think if the election had gone the other way, they might have already undertaken attacks on Iran's nuclear program.
Wow. Is there any normalization track between the Saudis and Israel at this point, or is that bridge completely destroyed?
I think it's over. I think it's completely over, and if the Saudis are interested in a defense pact with the United States, they should go for a defense pact with the United States. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself has said the price is a two-state solution. I don't see how the Crown Prince backs away from that. I don't see an off-ramp for that. It's one thing when the foreign minister says it. The Crown Prince, de facto ruler, future king, can defy the foreign minister, but I don't see how the Crown Prince backs down from a two-state solution. And 70+% of Israelis are now opposed to a two-state solution. So I don't see how you put that together. What I do think will happen is we'll go back to some sort of status quo ante before October 7th, which is where there were under-the-table talks between Israelis and Saudis on security issues. Some Israeli businessmen who carry third-party passports would get special visas to come into the kingdom, and vice versa if necessary. But you no longer hear Saudi officials talk about, oh, it's not a question of if we normalize, but a question of when we normalize. It's a much bigger hill to climb as a result of October 7th.
President Trump really doesn't give a lot of concern about the Middle East. He wants to get out. He wants to get America to get out. He wants all these problems to be solved by reasonableness. Is what we're seeing a pathway not to greater involvement in America in these problems, but rather the extraction of America? Something, I mean, I'm just interested in whether or not we're looking at this in the wrong way.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on here. I think that if you take President Trump and President Obama and you strip away the obvious differences in temperament, personality, whatever, these foreign policies are actually not that different. President Obama's first of all, President Obama engaged in maximum pressure to get the Iranians to the table, to get to the JCPOA. That's precisely what President Trump wants. He wants to put pressure on the Iranians to get to an agreement. And what are those agreements for? To bring the United States out of the region. Both of them, in their own ways, have talked about disentangling the United States from its foreign adventures in the Middle East. This is a lot of continuity between the Obama era and the Trump era. It just, no one can tell because they're totally different personalities.
So the other thing that's changing out there, or that's part of the season, is that as the U.S. is becoming more involved, within its own borders and whatnot, Europe is changing as well as it thinks about its interests. And French President Emmanuel Macron is sort of standing up very, and so he goes down and does what another leader has, and he just recently went down to the frontier between Egypt and Palestine, and was there and basically talked about this being a crime, and also saying that France intends to recognize Palestine as a state, probably sometime in June. So I'm interested in whether that is a whimper that means nothing, whether it's significant, and also all of the discussion about, two-state solution. Is this now become kind of a religion that has no traction in the real world anymore? But Macron, nonetheless, this last week said this.
Two-state solution is a religion that has no following, really, and it's done. It's over. Macron, in saying that, that's meaningful. That if he says we're going to recognize Palestine, it's meaningful if the French do it. It wasn't meaningful when the Irish did it. It wasn't meaningful when the Spanish did it. It wasn't meaningful when the Norwegians did it. But France, which is an important global power, has important relations with Israel, is an important partner of Egypt, of Saudi Arabia, of the UAE. If the French do it, we're talking about a major European country, not a country on the periphery of Europe, a major European country. And you can expect there's going to be a lot of
Israeli. So it's really
Israeli
not about statehood. It's about positioning then, right?
Oh, I think it's undoubtedly about positioning. I'm not sure what else he could say, because for the French president to show up on the border between Egypt and Gaza and say, look, folks, it's never going to happen, and there is really no day after plan, and what the more likely outcome is an Israeli occupation of part of, or if not all of the Gaza Strip, is not something that you would want to do to demonstrate your solidarity and support with people who've suffered, as well as sort of pick up the slack for the lack of American leadership on these issues, which is the French are always trying to do. But I think that when global leaders talk about a two-state solution, it's not helpful. I understand why they do it, but it is a religion without reality.
Let me ask you very quickly about your book, The End of Ambition, in which you basically argue that Americans have very antiquated, outdated senses of the Middle East. Is Donald Trump fixing that?
I'm not nice to everybody in the book, and I'm nice to everybody in the book. And I think that President Trump asked people like me in Washington during his first term, why do we do what we do? And we couldn't answer him. And that in the book, I try to talk about why we did what we did. But what I discovered was what we do in the Middle East is based on a bunch of bad assumptions about the power of the United States to transform the region, which is a really bad thing for the United States to do. When we try to use American power to make, quote unquote, good things happen, we tend to fail and sow instability. When we have a much clearer idea of what's important to us and how to defend those interests and how to prevent bad things from happening, we're much, much more successful, and we have better partners in the region.
Well, Counsel on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow Stephen Cook, thank you. This was a fantastic discussion. Thanks for your candor and sharing your thoughts today.
Thanks, Steve. Pleasure to be with you as always.
So what's the bottom line? The truth is that much of the world is trying to forget the victims of Gaza and to pave over the injustices there with forced displacement, with ethnic cleansing, and real estate development plans that have no connection to reality. With President Donald Trump, who is one of the key voices affecting Palestine's future, it's increasingly difficult to discern what is puffery and what is real. Is there another way? Well, I don't think so anytime soon, because it would need a gargantuan effort from other world leaders to put something new on the table. Not just European, but Arab, African, Latin American, and Asian leaders would have to all come together and become the stakeholders and visionaries of a competing vision that forces an alternative to that pushed by Trump and his ally, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. That alternative may be the only chance, though, for any sense of hope or peace and justice to take root again. And that's the bottom line.